The detective's voice was flat when he said it, like he was reading a grocery list instead of ending my career. "Mrs. Calloway, you're being arrested for embezzlement of client trust funds." I remember staring at his mouth moving and thinking, that's not possible. I built this branch from nothing. That was 14 years ago. My daughter wasn't even born yet. She grew up believing her grandmother was a thief, because that's what the newspapers said, that's what the plea deal implied, that's what silence taught her to believe. I never told her the truth, because I didn't have proof, only a feeling that gnawed at me every single night. Then 3 weeks ago, my daughter was cleaning out her late aunt's attic and found a suitcase that had been locked for over a decade. She called me, breathless, and said 4 words that changed everything. "Mom, there's a USB." What was on it would not just clear my mother's name. It would expose a man who had spent 14 years building an empire on her ruin, and he had no idea the woman he framed had a daughter smart enough, patient enough, and angry enough to finish what her mother started. My name is Elena Calloway, and before I explain the suitcase, I need you to understand the woman it belonged to. My mother, Ruth Calloway, spent 19 years as the branch manager of a regional bank in a small Ohio town, the kind of place where everybody's mortgage and every teenager's first savings account passed through her hands. She was meticulous. She balanced her own checkbook to the penny and made me do the same when I was 12, sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a red pen, telling me that numbers never lie, only people do. I was 7 years old the year everything fell apart, too young to understand what the men in suits were saying when they came to our house with a warrant, but old enough to remember my mother's face when they walked her out in handcuffs. She was accused of siphoning nearly $400,000 from the trust accounts of elderly clients, people who had trusted her with their entire life savings. She pleaded guilty. That detail haunted me more than anything else growing up, because if she was innocent, why didn't she fight? I asked my Aunt Diane once, when I was 16 and furious at the world, why my mother would confess to something she didn't do. Aunt Diane's answer was quiet and careful, because the lawyer told her a trial could get her 20 years, and a plea would get her 8, and she had a 7-year-old daughter who needed at least one parent walking free before she turned adult. I didn't understand sacrifice like that until I became a mother myself. My mother served 6 years before a routine prison illness turned fatal, and she died 11 months before her scheduled release. I was 13. I buried her without ever hearing her explain what actually happened, because every time I visited, the guards limited our conversations, and every time I asked, she would just say, "Baby, someday you'll understand, and someday you'll know I never touched a single dollar that wasn't mine." I grew up carrying 2 versions of my mother in my chest at the same time. The woman who taught me to balance a checkbook with the same discipline as a surgeon, and the woman whose name became a punchline in a town that never forgot. I became a forensic accountant, which people always assume was a coincidence, but it wasn't. I chose that career because somewhere underneath the grief, I needed to understand the world that destroyed her. I needed to know exactly how a person could disappear $400,000, because the version of my mother I remembered would never have made a mistake that sloppy, let alone a crime that greedy. My daughter, Maya, is 11 now, and she never met her grandmother. All she has are stories, a handful of photographs, and the reputation that still occasionally follows our family name in that town, even though we moved away years ago. 3 weeks ago, my Aunt Diane passed away from a stroke, sudden and painless, the kind of death that leaves you grateful and gutted in the same breath. Maya and I flew back to Ohio to help clear out her house, because Diane never married and had no other children, and somebody had to sort through 50 years of a life lived carefully and quietly. The attic was where Diane kept everything she couldn't bear to throw away. Old quilts, my mother's high school yearbooks, a shoebox of photographs from before I was born. And in the very back corner, behind a stack of Christmas decorations, sat a hard-shell suitcase with a small brass padlock, the kind of lock you could buy at any hardware store for a few dollars. Maya found it first. She dragged it out into the light, coughing from the dust, and asked me the question that started everything. "Whose is this?" "It's got a lock on it, Mom." Nobody locks a suitcase in an attic unless they're hiding something. 11 years old, and she already had her grandmother's instincts. I told her I didn't know whose it was, which was true in that moment, but something in my stomach turned cold the second I saw the handwriting on the small paper tag tied to the handle. It said, in my mother's careful cursive, for Elena, when she's ready. I had never seen this suitcase in my life. My aunt had kept it hidden, sealed, and silent for over a decade, and she had died without ever telling me it existed. We didn't have a key, so Maya, with the impatience of any 11-year-old faced with a locked mystery, found a bobby pin and a YouTube tutorial and had that cheap padlock open in under 3 minutes. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to protect it from the attic's humidity, was a manila folder stuffed with photocopied bank statements, a small leather-bound journal with my mother's handwriting filling every page, and taped to the bottom of the suitcase lining, a single USB drive with a strip of masking tape across it that read only, Marcus knows. Marcus. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 14 years, not since the trial. Not since the newspapers briefly mentioned him as a witness before he vanished from the story entirely. Marcus Whitfield had been my mother's assistant branch manager, 12 years younger than her, ambitious in the specific way that made older employees nervous. I remembered him vaguely as a man who brought my mother coffee and called her boss, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I hadn't thought about him in years. I had no idea, standing in that dusty attic with my daughter's wide eyes watching me, that Marcus Whitfield was about to become the most important name in my life again, because a quick search on my phone told me he was no longer an assistant manager at a small Ohio bank. He was now the chief financial officer of one of the largest regional banking conglomerates in the Midwest, a man with his photo on magazine covers about financial leadership, a man who had built his entire public reputation on the exact same year my mother lost everything. That night, after Maya finally fell asleep in Aunt Diane's guest room, I sat at the kitchen table with my mother's journal and a laptop, my hands trembling in a way they hadn't since I was 13 years old at her funeral. The journal was dated starting 18 months before her arrest, and reading it felt like hearing her voice again for the first time in over a decade. She had suspected something was wrong with the trust account reconciliations months before anyone accused her of anything. Small discrepancies, a few $100s here, a transfer that didn't match its paperwork there, the kind of thing most people would dismiss as clerical error. My mother never dismissed anything. She started keeping her own private ledger, cross-referencing every discrepancy against the official bank records, building what was essentially a shadow audit without telling anyone, because she didn't yet know who to trust. 3 entries in, she wrote the sentence that made my chest tighten. Marcus has access to override codes he shouldn't have. I asked IT why, and they said he requested elevated permissions for a training exercise that I never approved. 2 months later, I confronted him privately. He apologized, said it was a mistake, said he'd correct it. The numbers stopped moving for 3 weeks. Then they started again, but now the discrepancies are showing up under my login credentials, not his. My mother, meticulous to a fault, had photocopied the internal system logs the week before her arrest, the ones showing that transfers had been authorized under her employee ID during hours she was documented as being at a dentist appointment, a school pickup for me, a funeral for a family friend. Someone had cloned her access or stolen her credentials, and she had physical proof of the timeline discrepancy sitting in a manila folder that never made it into her defense. I asked my aunt's neighbor, an elderly woman named Carol who had worked at the courthouse for 30 years and still lived 2 doors down, why this evidence never surfaced at trial. She remembered the case well. Everyone in that town did, and she told me something that made the cold feeling in my stomach turn into something closer to rage. Your mother's lawyer was a public defender carrying 40 cases at once, sweetheart. He told her a trial was a gamble she couldn't afford with a young daughter at home, and honestly, back then, going against a man who was cooperating fully with prosecutors and had a spotless personnel file, it looked like an uphill battle nobody wanted to fight. Marcus Whitfield had testified against her. He had been the prosecution's star witness, describing my mother as increasingly erratic and secretive in the months before her arrest, painting the exact picture of guilt that made a plea deal feel like her only reasonable option. The USB drive took me 2 days to properly examine, because the files on it were encrypted with a password protocol my mother had clearly learned specifically for this purpose, something she'd never had reason to know before her world collapsed. I finally cracked it using her wedding anniversary combined with my birthday, a code so personal that only she and I would have ever guessed it. Inside were audio files. My mother had recorded 3 conversations with Marcus in the final month before her arrest, using an old digital recorder she must have hidden in her desk drawer. In the clearest recording, Marcus's voice is unmistakable, calm and reasonable, telling my mother that if she pushes this further, brings in outside auditors, makes noise about the discrepancies, it will destroy both their careers and nobody will believe a mid-level assistant manager acted alone anyway. Then he says the sentence that made me put my hand over my mouth in that quiet kitchen. "You have a daughter to think about, Ruth." I don't. That was a threat wrapped in concern, and my mother had understood it exactly that way, because 2 weeks later she was arrested, and Marcus Whitfield was never so much as investigated. He testified, collected a promotion within 18 months, and quietly transferred to a larger institution 2 states away before anyone could connect the timeline too closely. I sat there at 3 in the morning with 14 years of grief reorganizing itself into something sharper and more useful. My mother hadn't confessed because she was guilty. She had confessed because she was protecting me from a trial she had already learned she couldn't win against a man with better lawyers, a cleaner record, and absolutely nothing to lose by letting a working single mother take the fall. I am not a woman who screams. I never have been. What I am is a forensic accountant with 14 years of professional experience reading exactly the kind of financial architecture that Marcus Whitfield had built his entire empire on top of, and I now had my mother's original shadow ledger, timestamp system logs proving credential cloning, and an audio recording of him essentially confessing to the threat that ended her life. The next morning, I did not call the police. I had learned enough about how the system had failed my mother to know that walking into a station with a decade-old audio file would get me a polite dismissal and nothing more. Instead, I called the one person from that old bank who might still be willing to talk. Her name was Patricia Nguyen, and 14 years ago, she had been the teller who worked the counter closest to my mother's office. A young woman who had once, quietly at the funeral, told 13-year-old me that she never believed the official story. Patricia answered on the second ring. And when I told her who I was, there was a long pause before she said, "I wondered if this day would ever come." She had never forgotten what she'd seen in her last month working under my mother, specifically a late-night conversation she'd overheard between Marcus and the branch's outside auditor, a man who had since retired and, according to Patricia, had been paid a very generous consulting fee the same quarter my mother was arrested. Patricia had kept a private note of the date and amount for years, uncertain what to do with a memory that felt important but unprovable. Combined with my mother's ledger, this was no longer just a suspicion. It was a pattern, and patterns are exactly what get financial crimes prosecuted. I spent the next 4 weeks doing what I do best, quietly, methodically, without alerting a single person connected to Marcus Whitfield's current life. I filed formal record requests for the original bank's archived personnel and audit files, most of which still existed in a regional records facility because financial institutions are legally required to retain certain documents for well beyond a decade. I cross-referenced every transfer date in my mother's original ledger against Marcus's documented work schedule and against the training exercise excuse IT had given her, which I discovered had never actually been logged as an approved request anywhere in the system, meaning he had lied about it from the very first conversation. I built the exact kind of shadow audit my mother had started 14 years earlier, except this time I had a law degree's worth of understanding about how to make it admissible, and I had something my mother never had, a state bar-certified private investigator I hired using savings I'd been quietly building for exactly a situation like this one, because some part of me, I now realized, had never stopped preparing to fight this fight. Maya asked me one evening why I was staying up so late every night with my laptop and a stack of papers, and I made a decision in that moment that surprised even me. I told her the truth, in language an 11-year-old could hold on to without breaking under its weight. I told her that her grandmother had been innocent, that a man had used her trust and her love for me against her, and that we were going to prove it, not with anger, but with facts so solid nobody could argue with them. Maya looked at the photograph of my mother on the refrigerator, the one from my 8th grade graduation that Ruth never got to attend, and she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. So Grandma's suitcase was like a letter she wrote to the future, and we're the only ones who could read it. Exactly, baby. Exactly that. The private investigator, a former financial crimes detective named Robert Alvarez, confirmed within 3 weeks that the retired auditor's consulting fee traced back through 2 shell accounts to a payment that originated the same week Marcus testified against my mother. It wasn't proof of everything, but combined with the credential cloning logs, the recorded threat, and Patricia's corroborating account, it was more than enough to reopen a case, especially once Robert quietly reached out to a financial crimes reporter he trusted, a woman who had spent years investigating institutional cover-ups and who recognized immediately that a sitting CFO with a buried fraud case in his past was precisely the kind of story that mattered. I want to be clear about something, because I promised myself I would handle this the way my mother would have wanted, not the way 14 years of grief sometimes tempted me to. I did not leak anything anonymously. I did not go for public humiliation first. I requested, through a lawyer, a formal meeting with Marcus Whitfield's legal counsel, presenting the evidence calmly, professionally, and completely, and offering him one chance to come forward voluntarily before the reporter's story and the request for judicial review became public. He refused. His lawyer called my evidence circumstantial and outdated, which told me everything I needed to know about a man who still believed silence and time were enough protection. He was wrong. The reporter's investigation, published 6 weeks later, accompanied by my formal petition for post-conviction review, built on documented evidence rather than accusation alone. The story detailed the credential cloning logs, the falsified training exercise, the recorded threat, and the traceable consulting payment, laid out with the same cold precision my mother had used in her own hidden ledger 14 years earlier. Within 72 hours, the banking conglomerate placed Marcus Whitfield on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Within 3 weeks, state prosecutors reopened the original case, and 2 months after that, a judge formally vacated my mother's conviction, citing newly discovered evidence of prosecutorial reliance on a witness who had concealed a material conflict of interest. It was not a full trial, not the courtroom vindication some part of me had always imagined, but it was something better in its own way. It was the truth, finally written into the permanent record, in language a judge signed his name to. Marcus Whitfield was indicted 4 months later on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and witness tampering. I did not attend his arraignment, because by then I had already gotten what I came for, and I understood something my mother had tried to teach me at that kitchen table with a calculator and a red pen. The numbers were never going to lie for him forever. They just needed someone patient enough to read them correctly. We buried an amended headstone for my mother that spring, one that no longer sat beneath the shadow of a crime she never committed. Maya laid white roses at the base and asked if her grandmother could somehow know what we had done. I told her I believed she already did, because she was the one who packed that suitcase, locked it, and trusted that someday, someone she loved would be ready to open it and finish what she started. Some inheritances arrive as money or property. Ours arrived as a locked suitcase in a dusty attic, and inside it was something far more valuable than either. It was proof that the truth, even buried for 14 years, does not expire. It only waits for someone patient enough and loving enough to go looking for it.